This is True North Story, the original podcast series. Are you ready to discover your True North Story? With your hosts, Tama Fulton and John Hudson Messerol.
I've been throwing knives to see just where they land. Now my world is in your hand. Send in the congregation. Open your eyes, step in the light. A jukebox generation.
Hello.
John Hart.
Hey, John, how are you?
I am fine. How are you?
I'm doing great.
Hi, John Hart.
Hey, guys.
We are so honored, blessed, and I would say privileged to get to talk to you. I have just loved your writing from the very beginning, which I guess is 2006 with King of Lies. When I first read that book, it just really, really resonated with me. And of course, for our audience, John Hart is an amazing writer, a New York Times best-selling writer, an Edgar Allan Poe award-winning writer. I mean, just on. And you've got 5 amazing books and a new one coming out soon. So we'll get into all of that and get into learning more about John Hart. And we just thank you for agreeing to talk to us today.
Well, thank you so much for those kind words. I've had the occasion to listen to your podcast a number of times now, and I'm delighted to be a part of it. I think you guys do a really nice job.
We like to talk to people of different influences in life. For you, your writing, your passions in life. We like to provide inspiration, motivation, encouragement, and hope to our audience through the life journeys of our guests. And may I just say, John, that you have had quite a ride so far in your life. You've done some incredibly amazing things.
Well, I appreciate your take on it. I'm not sure that my parents saw it that way in the early years. They thought me hopelessly adrift, but I'm delighted where I am now, and I'm very happy to be able to talk about it with you guys. So thanks again for having me.
We're blessed, and our audience will be too. Of that I am assured. So, John, that's a great place to start. You're talking about your parents. You know, we talk with a lot of guests and creatives and scientists and all kinds of folks and analytical people, and it usually comes back to the parents, and they either encouraged or they were less than encouraging, and it kind of changed the path or the trajectory of their life choices. And so I just wanted to kind of get a little background on your childhood and growing up with your parents in North Carolina, I'm assuming, and tell us a little bit about John as a child.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're correct. It is North Carolina. I was born in Durham, raised in a little town called Salisbury, which is north of Charlotte, a small town, about 30,000 people, and then you may recognize the name. My first 2 books are set in that town.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep, and that's a whole nother kettle of trouble right there, setting novels in one's hometown.
Oh, I'll bet.
But, I was raised by wonderful people who, and it's kind of a contradiction, John, because they always said you can achieve anything you put your mind to, but at the same time, they're very traditional thinkers, meaning professional routes were the ones to be followed. Right,
Right.
Law, et cetera. And so I got into this really interesting place where I did all those things. I mean, I got a master's in accounting. I had a law degree. I worked as an attorney, stockbroker, banker, all of these types of things. Of course, and we may get into this more later, I was aspiring to write the whole time. I mean, I outlined my first novel when I was 20. I wrote my first when I was in graduate school, wrote a second in law school. Those were both unpublished.
Wow.
But I knew that I had to check the boxes, meaning I needed to be able to have a career, feed my family, et cetera, should the writing not work out. And so I think my parents gave me this great belief that I could, in fact, do anything that I wanted with my life, but they also wanted me to understand that things don't come for free and that I have to be prepared to meet my responsibilities. So that's sort of the pedestal on which they raised me. And the contradictions came a little bit when I started this idea of walking away from those traditional professional paths and started thinking more and more about writing. There was just a real, and this was not so much my father, he was a little looser about this, but my mother and stepfather, who really raised me, they really felt that I needed to keep my eye on the other prize, meaning the professional path. To kind of put a wrapper around this, so I was 35 with a stay-at-home wife, a young child, 2.5 years or so into my law practice, when I decided I was going to quit to write a third book. Now, this was after 2 failed books. So you can imagine the type of reaction that I was met with by my parents, who thought I was the height of irresponsibility to even consider such a thing. But I've known for so long that I wanted to write, and of course you guys know this as well as anyone, but there's no blueprint to success in publishing. I mean, it's a combination of so many things, perseverance and luck and what little bit of talent God gives us.
Well, God has given you a little more than a little talent. Your writing is phenomenal, and we're blessed that you share it with us. I mean, quite honestly.
Well, I'll tell you this. I will take that as a compliment, and happily so. If one were to ask me what I'm proud of in this whole journey, it's the fact that I never quit. Because I do think that the talent, I didn't necessarily work for it. Yes, I honed it, and I worked hard to perfect it, but it was just there. But every time I had to face a choice between the path of least resistance and quitting another job or walking away from another opportunity to write, I always took that hard choice and chose the writing through, as I said, 2 failed books and a lot of frustration with my folks, and that's what I'm proud of.
It's really interesting. I wanted to ask you this. We talked to Greg Iles, another amazing Southern writer, and he said that writers are not made, that they're born. I just am curious to get your take on that. I don't think one way is right or wrong. I'm just curious if you believe that writers can be made or if they are born.
I think he's correct. I think Greg is correct when he says they're born. I think there is wiggle room in there. And let me hold forth for a minute. I think the most important thing that a writer has to have is just the unwavering desire, which leads to the kind of perseverance that can convince you to start one book after a failed book and then start a third book after a second failed book. And that kind of perseverance you're either born with or you're not. So there's that. Because, as I said, there's no blueprint and no one standing over your shoulder to say you're doing this right, this will lead to success. It's a sustained leap of faith, right?
Sure.
There's that element, and then there's, I'll call it the talent element. And I think this is what Greg was referring to. Yes, you can train a good writer to be a better writer. It's very hard to make a non-writer into a writer, and it's very hard to make a good writer a great writer. I think the realm there is that you can make, there's something in the middle where you can make a decent writer a better writer. You can make a good writer a better writer. It's very hard to teach someone how to be a great writer. And I don't pretend to have that particular checkbox on my resume. I'm not saying that, but I do think that there is let's call it the voice, that really great writers are able to harness and deliver time and time again. That's a very difficult thing to teach.
You're so right about that. And I know, too, that you obviously went through academia. You were checking all the boxes, fulfilling all of the dreams of your family to go into accounting and law. Do you feel like, even though maybe that's not where your life trajectory ended up, that built a foundation for you of some kind that added to your voice in your writing?
Oh, I think it did. And I think it did so in many and unexpected ways. None of us can really list all of the forces that bring us to where we are in life. And so many things shape us. And if you remove 1, 2 things or start pulling on threads, it's impossible to know what you might be removing from this very vital equation of who we are and why. So I can't point to accounting, for instance, and say that helped me, right?
Right.
But let me tell you how it did. And this is, I love questions that lead me to think about things in different light, because this is kind of interesting. I was 27 when I started a master's degree in accounting. I had already outlined my first novel when I was 20. I was living down at the beach, the North Carolina coast. I was restoring sailboats. And after working on the boats all day, and by the way, I should clarify that restoring sailboats, that's just sexy talk for sanding teak for minimum wage.
Oh, my goodness.
That's better than it is.
Laying on your back and scrubbing away. And
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. But then I would go to the local watering hole and have a beer and outline this novel, and it never got off the cocktail napkin, right? I still actually have this stack of napkins.
Oh, I love that.
But when I found myself 7 years later studying for this master's in accounting, I was very much an underdog in this program, and by that I mean that my mind does not work that way. Everyone else in the program got it. It came naturally. I was there for a series of different reasons that, in retrospect, make very little sense. But I was so unqualified for that particular path of study that I had to work 3 times as hard as anyone else just to keep my head above water. I mean, it was a 12-hour-a-day commitment. The reason that I think this matters in terms of how that might have affected me is that it forced me to do a very difficult thing, and that was to stop talking about writing a book and actually write one. Because
the rubber meets the road, right?
Right. I mean, I was so unhappy at that course of study and at the thought of continuing that I would work until about 10 at night and then just out of sheer desperation write fiction every night until about midnight or 1 in the morning. It was my only release. And it was just a pivotal moment in my life. And honestly, had I not fallen into that course of study, I might not have ever found the will to actually do the hard work.
That is amazing. It is so funny that you mentioned that because, I went and completed an MBA in business school, and one of them was derivative asset analysis, okay, in structured finance. And I'm just like, I'm like you. I'm like, what am I doing? Like they start talking about the Black-Scholes option pricing model, and they're in formulas on boards with, I didn't even recognize it. It looked like a foreign language to me, right? And I'm like, as a creative, I so identify with what he just said. It's like working so much harder. And the guy next to me is just like, yeah, you don't get it. It's blah, 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 blah. And I'm going, what are you talking about? You could have been speaking Greek. I don't know what. But when it comes to sitting down with your thoughts and your characters and your stories and the narratives and the dialogue, and they start talking in your head, and you start going, we could do this, and they're motivated this way, and what if we do this? And it's like magic happens.
And it's so completely different. I actually remember that Black-Scholes model, and it was Chinese to me as well.
Okay.
There was one guy in my class, I called him the golden boy because it came so easily to him, and without him I would have never, ever finished that course of study. I mean, he took me under his wing and nursed me through that very difficult time. But it's funny, we never know, do we?
We never know.
Going to reach in.
You've had a lot of travels in your life as well, John. Just doing a little bit of digging research on you. You spent some time in Europe. You spent some time up in Alaska, I'm guessing, working on the pipeline. I'm not sure, but tell us about kind of where you were before you landed back in North Carolina.
Sure, absolutely. And it kind of fits into the arc of my life story, I guess, in that I always suspected that I was supposed to be doing something a little unusual with my life in terms of making a living. And I know that because I fought so hard this idea of having the traditional job. I mean, I didn't want an office. I didn't want clients. I didn't want schedules. And so that part of me was at war with the way that I was raised, as we've already discussed. So I remember getting out of school, deciding, all right, there's got to be more out here. I'm going to go to Europe. I'm going to travel. I'm going to sail boats. I'm going to try to find some calling. I mean, I was a helicopter pilot for a while, although just on the student level, but I thought maybe I wanted to fly helicopters. I thought maybe I wanted to be a delivery captain. Ironically, I think I spent a year in Alaska when I was younger, and when I finished this Master's of Accounting we were talking about, I'd actually written about half of this first book that was never published. And I was supposed to start law school that fall, and I was so convinced that I could finish that book, sell it for $1 million, and never have to have a real job. This is, of course, just the height of idiocy. I mean, I look back at that thinking now and marvel at how clueless I was. But I was clueless enough to defer law school, and I moved back to Alaska, and I would work odd jobs for a month until I had enough money, and then I would quit and write for a month. And I did that all year until I finished my first unpublished novel. And, of course, it was never agented. It was never sold. I found myself in law school a year later than planned and got halfway through that program and decided, I don't think I'm going to be a lawyer either, so maybe it's time to write another book. So the travels, they were one way of trying to find a path. The writing was another way. And it was all kind of built on this idea that, all the things that I'd taught were supposed to be the normal path just never felt right to me.
That is so amazing, John, because it's like you had this nagging passion that was always there that you couldn't kick, which was your need and your love for writing, but yet you were searching in all these other places for something else, but yet you were constantly coming back to the writing, right?
Absolutely. I mean, people would, when The King of Lies was published and became a bestseller and my life changed, people would say things to me like, "Can you believe how fast this happened?" And my response was invariably the same: "No, I've been trying for 15 years to make this happen. This is not an overnight success story. This is a 15-year overnight success story." So
that's unbelievable.
Yeah, I guess it's just like that. I mean, it happened very quickly from the outside, but from the inside, it was very, very slow.
So here we are. You're 35 years old. You've got a wife who's a stay-at-home mom. You've got a young daughter, I believe, named Sailor, and I would imagine that's because of your love of boats and the sea.
It is.
And so here you are, John, and you decide that you're going to hang up your law cloak and you're going to take on the writing and you gave yourself a year. How did that manifest itself? I know that you said your family thought you were maybe a little bit crazy to do that and irresponsible, but talk about that year and how you made ends meet and how you managed being a dad and a husband and a writer.
Well, there were a number of things that kind of happened at the same time. And let me preface this by saying, John, you were talking about my passion for writing, et cetera.
Right.
I mean, yes, I'm absolutely passionate about writing, but I much prefer to have written and to actually write. It's hard work, right? I mean,
right,
it's
absolutely.
hard, lonesome work, and I never know if it's going to turn out at the end, right? I mean, I described it earlier as this sustained leap of faith. I feel that it's going to work, but until I've gotten to the end and I see that all the pieces fit and it makes sense, it's actually a process fraught with frustration, angst, sleepless nights, and worry, right? Because I've got this family that's dependent on my ability to deliver these books, and I've got publishers that are waiting for the words on a page. And so it is wonderful. There's nothing I'd rather do, but it doesn't come without cost. And those costs are generally in the shape of insecurity and doubt and worry. And it seems that no matter how many books I finish, that happens. I mean, I can't shrug that off. But that's okay. That's the cost of doing business, and I'm happy to pay that cost. But getting to your question, Tamara, back when I was 35 and living in this town, now this is the town of Salisbury, where I was raised and where I practiced law. My wife is from there.
Oh, wow.
My parents are there. Her parents are there. 3 different things, I guess, came together about this same time. Professionally, I've been in the practice of law long enough to start getting really bad clients. And by this, I mean, as a young lawyer, you generally get the people that aren't truly evil. You know, they're foolish, they're short-sighted, they get drunk and wreck their car, they get in a fight. You know, they're not necessarily evil. Once you do your time, then you start picking up the really bad people. You get involved with the murderers and the rapists, and, you know, that never really sat too well with me.
Criminal defense attorney?
I was,
or
yes,
okay,
I was
okay.
a criminal defense attorney.
Okay.
My politics are more in the prosecution vein.
Okay.
But starting salary for prosecutors in Rowan County was $28,000 a year, and that was just not realistic.
Yikes.
I wanted my wife to be able to stay home with the kids, at least as long as she wanted to. I took a job as a criminal defense attorney. I loved being in trial. I loved the camaraderie of it. I loved all the behind-the-scenes stuff. The thing I really disliked were my clients.
Really?
Largely because they were guilty. And as I got into the second, third year of my practice, started getting these really bad guys. And so right about the time that I was starting to think about writing a third novel, I was assigned to defend my first child molester. And he was guilty, and I won't go into the details of the case, but he wanted to know how I was going to fix it. And this happened to be a fairly short time after my daughter was born, 7 or 8 weeks, I want to say.
Wow.
And it just seemed so wrong to meet this person in the holding cell at the local detention center, bill the state. I was court appointed, you know, a few $100 or whatever it was going to be for that day's work, and then go home and lift my daughter out of the pen with the same hands. It felt really wrong to me. Mm-hmm. So I started to think I wanted to try a final time. And my conviction was simply this. I've tried once when I was in my master's program, once when I was in law school. I knew that I couldn't be a good father, a good lawyer, and a good writer all at once. Those things are too time demanding, right?
Sure,
so,
absolutely.
I started to think as kind of a matter of personal faith that what I needed to do really was quit my job and give myself a year and just say I'm a writer. I love these stories of Scott Turow that wrote Presumed Innocent on the train to work, and John Grisham writing at 4 a.m. before putting in a full day before the bar. I just know myself well enough to know I can't do that.
Yeah.
I don't multitask that well. So I really started to think what I needed to do was quit my job And I delayed and delayed and delayed until I got this client. And I said to myself that I'm just not going to represent this person. And the judge would not recuse me from the case. The firm thought I was being squeamish. So it really, if I were going to walk away from that case, I really had to walk away from the practice. And so that just seemed like my wake-up call to take the time off to write a third book, one final shot at the title. The struggles, of course, are these. Small town, my parents are there, and we've talked about their expectations, and then, of course, my wife's parents. Now, my wife is her father's only daughter. My daughter was her father's only grandchild. Her father's a tough guy. I mean, he was orphaned, raised himself on the streets, fought in Korea, flew jets in Vietnam, self-made guy, really tough guy.
God bless you for being the son-in-law. My goodness.
Yeah. And I knew when I decided that I was going to quit my job, I knew what my parents would say. They would be disappointed. But this is the guy that really frightened me because I was responsible for his only daughter. And I respected him and I liked him. He passed away recently. That's why I'm using the past tense.
Okay.
But he really shocked me. You know, I told him what I wanted to do and why. And he said these exact words. He said, John, I recognize your passion. And let me tell you this. If you don't do this, if you don't quit your job and give yourself this year, you will regret it for the rest of your life. If you need to sell your house and move in with us, we'll support your family for as long as it takes.
How about that?
Oh, my
goodness.
Isn't
that something? And I gave him a hard time for years because I've often thought about the exact word choice he used, and I'm pretty sure when he said, I'll feed your family for as long as it takes, I'm not sure I was included in that. He says I was. And then for me, it was just a very necessary choice to make a broad public statement of what I was doing. I mean, I told my friends in the DA's office. I let my parents' friends know. I pretty much announced that I was quitting my job to write this book because I knew at that point there would be no choice but to finish it.
Right. You put some pressure on yourself, for sure. Well, and I did want to touch on this just a little bit because I just absolutely love The King of Lies. It's just such an amazing book, and obviously that is the first published book that you wrote. How much of you is in the character work, if any, and kind of the situation? Because he's an attorney, right? He's struggling. He's, got family issues, and tell us a little bit about that and the process of coming up with that story as your first novel.
I was obviously a very unhappy defense attorney in that town. In fact, in that house, Work's house was my house. I dirtied it up a little bit, put some moss on the roof, and flaked off the paint. But it was that house looking down on that park, and I would sit on that front porch at the end of the day and have a beer and talk to my wife and just unwind. And I don't outline. I don't know if you ever asked that question of your writers, but
you just expound. Just go anywhere you want, as writers ourselves and our audience wanting to gain insight.
Different writers have different systems.
Yeah, for sure.
It's amazing. And it seems to me that one of the biggest dividing lines between novelists are those that outline and those that don't. People that outline, they're passionate that they're right. I mean, they're utterly convinced it's the only way to go. I write in what I call the school of grope and hope. I always start off with a good sense of who my main character is. I know a couple of the emotional drivers that are going to propel that person through the story, but I have no idea where the story is going to go. And that's exactly what happened with The King of Lies. I did not set out to write a mystery or a thriller or a family drama or a Southern Gothic or any of the terms you could use to describe that book. I was just trying to tell a story. Your question was how much of me is in this character, Work Pickens.
Right.
Now, Work is kind of a broken guy. He hates being a lawyer. He's in it for the wrong reasons. Part of the book is about his determining why he made those choices and why they're wrong. The only part of me that was really in Work is that it was in my hometown. He lived in my house. And like Work, I really hated the practice of criminal defense work. I mean, that kind of law. In fact, I believe it's the very opening scene to The King of Lies is Work Pickens in a holding cell with a client who was just found guilty and given life without parole. And that's arguably some of the best descriptive fiction I've ever done, because I've been in that room so many times and I knew what it smelled like and felt like and how it was to be there with people that were guilty and had been found guilty. I set out to tell this story about what happened when Work's father turned up murdered after an 18-month absence. And what's kind of funny, and there are places where reality intersects fiction, right? And I think every book has that wavering line where only the author can truly see all the places that fact and fiction touch on this wavering line. And in Salisbury, for instance, well, let me back up. In The King of Lies, when Work's father's body was found, it was found in an abandoned shopping center that was being demolished, and he'd been in this room for 18 months, and his corpse was fairly dried out, desiccated thing. Something very similar to that happened in Salisbury a few years before I wrote The King of Lies. There was an old shopping center down by the interstate that had struggled for years. About 2/3 of the storefronts were closed, and a few were still struggling. One of them was a woman's hair salon, and this is the kind of place where, you know, the older women would go once a week and get their hair washed and blown out, and that would be their hair for the next week.
Kind of a Steel Magnolias kind of place.
Yeah, very much like that.
Yeah.
I used to go to that place when I was a kid, and there was a movie theater right next door. And when they finally demolished this place, they bit into a locked closet and found the remains of a homeless man who'd been murdered and left there 3 years earlier, as it turned out.
Holy
And
cow.
it really stuck with me, this idea that right adjacent to the place that these women would go to have their hair done, you know, just inches away through the drywall, was this body for years. And so that sort of gave me the general idea of how to start the novel. I knew that Work was racked with feelings of guilt and shame, but I didn't know what he was guilty or shameful about. I could just see it very clearly. And that he would have to examine everything anew when the body of his father was discovered. And for those who've read the book, you will know that so much of his journey is about learning to reconcile his own wants and desires with the things that his father really propelled him to do with his life for all the wrong reasons. So the book's as much about that kind of internal self-discovery as anything else. And I never knew what the book was going to be from month to month. You know, I just wrote in a linear fashion and tried the best I could.
This is True North Story, the original podcast series. And now, back to the program.
Johnny is my main man. He's the keeper of the keys. You put your mind at ease. He's guaranteed to please, backed by popular demand. Look around, my little friend. Jubilation in the land. Ready, get ready. Rock steady when Johnny strikes up the band.
Being from a small town and writing with a setting in a small town, did you go into the grocery store and have people come and say, "Did you write about me? Was I this character?"
Let me tell you something. This is one of my favorite stories, as sad as it is. So I chose to set that book in the town of Salisbury, North Carolina, because that's where I was practicing law. I knew it. I could see it all. It's good. It's bad. Being in the criminal justice system really showed me some of the darker corners of the county that I never knew growing up. You know, the dead-end dirt roads and the burned-out trailers and some of the horrible things that happened. But when I wrote the book, my decision was to set it in Salisbury for convenience sake. And then if I ever got published, I would probably change the name of the town to protect myself from the kind of people you're referring to. And then I got so excited when I got a publishing offer that I completely forgot. And it was published, set in Salisbury, and I went on a 6-week tour. And when I came home, everything had changed. The book was this big success. Pretty much everyone in town had read it. And you'll remember that there are two very unpleasant women in this book.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And by unpleasant, you know, I'm talking about Barbara's friends. You know, they're insincere, social climbing, money grubbing, backstabbing, just. And I returned home, and the question that was on everyone's lips was that, who are these women? And I would never be foolish enough to lift someone whole cloth.
Very
Not
smart
for
man. Exactly.
Yeah, that would just be foolish. But so many people thought that it was the same two women that rumors started to spread that I was saying it was these women. And I'm pretty sure that these women believe that, because even now they really won't speak to me.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, it's really,
You gotta be
sad.
kidding me.
I tell that story a lot, hoping that it will circulate enough to get back to them, and so they can stop thinking that I actually picked on them, because I did not.
Wow. Well, I got to tell you, John, I love the grope and hope strategy, because as a writer myself, I probably tend to be more in that camp than the outline camp. I wonder, how does that fit into your process, like when you sit down, or you were talking about the anxiety and the fear, and the expectation from the publisher, and not so much now because you've made a name for yourself and you've got a history of books out there. But still, I mean, I get it, that pressure's still there. How does that affect your process? Like when you sit down, you've just got some characters and some ideas, and much more like me, it's kind of like a framework, and then you just run with it, and where it goes, it goes?
So I've put a lot of thought into this question because I have writer friends that berate me if I'm late on a delivery because I have an outline. And they say, if you would just outline, you could hit your deadline. So I've put a lot of thought in this. Am I doing this wrong? And I think this is how it breaks down. I think the people that can sit down for whatever the amount of time is, 1 month, 6 months, and actually craft a document that foresees every twist and turn and character evolution so that they can then just sit down and start writing it, they must be much smarter than I. Because I have to live with these characters month after month before I really understand them well enough to make the motivations credible. And as you know, motivations, they have to ring true for every character in the book. They have to be real. If you're an outliner and you have your document and it's trustworthy, I think your job then becomes very boring because you're basically...
It's like formulaic, right? It's like formula writing.
Even if it's not formulaic, once you have your outline and you're just building your prose, you may as well be making widgets in a lot of ways because all the excitement for me would be gone. The Growth and Hope School is the more exciting way to write. It's also the more fearsome way to write. If I knew on page 100 exactly what was going to be happening for the next 300 pages, then I wouldn't be sleepless at 3 a.m. But I also would not have the joy of discovery the next day when I think of some beautiful little twist or some fabulous character flaw or some relationship. How can a writer possibly know all of the things that will come to them over the year it takes to write that book?
There's
I've tried
no way.
to outline, and generally it becomes a moot document after about page 5. Because my characters are okay, no, they're going to be better this way. Or I have these signings, as every author does, and I invariably get someone comes through the line, and they'll say something like this: I really loved your book, but I knew who did it on page 50. And I wish that I could show them the inside of my mind, because I probably didn't know who did it until page 150.
Right.
Yes.
So I write every book the same way. So the 5 or 6 main characters that you'll meet in the first 100 pages all have secrets and dark corners and possible motivations for whatever the bad thing is. And it's not until I've lived with these people for months and months that I understand who did what for what reasons and can then, take the reins, so to speak. And
it's sort of like planting a garden with magic seeds, and you see them sprouting, but you don't know what they're going to become. And then when you've got your full harvest, you're like, wow, look at this. And then you see it come to fruition.
Well, I just wanted to jump on something John said about prose. I want to read something here. This is just an example for our audience. The amazing talent that John encapsulates in his prose. Okay, this is from Redemption Road. This is just an opening paragraph to chapter 3, which I just absolutely love. It says, "It was a paradox of life behind walls, that any day could end in blood, every morning contrived to start exactly the same. A man woke and, for 2 heartbeats of his heart, didn't know where he was or what he'd become. Those few seconds were magic. A warm flicker before reality walked across his chest, the black dog of remembrance trailing at its feet. This morning was no different from any other, stillness at first, then memories of all the things that had come with 13 years in a box. Moments like that were bad enough for most. For a cop, they were worse. For a cop like Adrian, they were unbearable." I mean, that is amazing, John.
Well, thanks for saying so. The funny thing is I remember specifically writing that paragraph. In fact, I had that phrase, the black dog of remembrance, in my mind before I even started the book.
That just brings such a picture to your brain.
Walking across his chest.
I have no idea where it came from. But at one point, I was even thinking that might make the title of the book. It's funny, though, because there are other places, pages and scenes, et cetera, that for me are just, I hate to use the term filler, but like I struggle, right? And I'm just trying to get to the place where I know exactly what I'm going to do. And I finish the book and think those must be the worst of the pages. And then people will come to me at events or send emails and talk about how much they love that particular passage or how much it impacted them for whatever reason. And I'm like, God, man, I hated writing that. I mean, I fought for every single word. And I've learned through the years to have a distrust of inspired writing. You know, the inspired writing, when you look at it a few days later, is often just purple writing. So I guess the converse is that I've really come to understand that sometimes the words that you fight hardest for can actually be the most impactful.
Well, there you said it, putting in that hard work and seeing the reward, not maybe for yourself at the moment, but and how it resonates with others.
Exactly, Tim. That's what I was going to say, is that everybody takes something else away. It's kind of like what we're trying to do with this podcast. There's something for everyone. You know, someone might resonate with a scientist. Someone might resonate with John Hart, who wants to be a writer or who loves your writing or who aspires to create meaningful stories in their own lives. That's just part of being a writer, I guess, is you're going to get all kinds of different wacky folks in your audience.
Well, I'll tell you, and it's always a treat to meet the writers that I've read and admired for years, and I've been able to meet so many of them. It's been a real perk of the job, so to speak. But I love meeting writers that are not as far along as I am, that are trying to get their first book published or trying to break out or trying to figure out how to even finish that first manuscript. Because the industry, I don't think they mean to do this, but there is a resonance that comes out from publishing that is basically saying, you know, we don't need you, and we're so big and busy that you shouldn't even bother. And I think that crushes the drive of a lot of young writers. And I think it's so important for people to understand that there's always going to be a need for new talent. It's very depressing for me to meet writers that have thrown in the towel too soon, because that could have been me after the first failed manuscript or the second failed manuscript. And in fact, I'll take this even a little deeper. When I finished The King of Lies, I made a huge rookie mistake and started sending it off to agents immediately. I mean, literally, like the day I wrote the end, I was sending out query letters. And for the next 9 months, I was rejected by everyone that saw it. And I was so despondent after that. I mean, I thought, okay, well, that's my third try, and I'm never going to try a fourth. This is the end of it. I'd started a new career at Merrill Lynch at that point. And then finally, I kind of just kicked myself in the pants and said, look, let's dedicate a couple months to what I should have done in the first place, which is a really serious edit. And with that perspective, I mean, having so many months between the end and looking at it with fresh eyes, I could see all the problems that I should have never allowed to go out into the world, the plot holes, the bad dialogue, the tin writing. In 2 months of work, and I fixed it, and I started sending it out again, and the first agent that saw it wanted to represent it. But that's how close I came to, you know, almost not getting that book published.
Almost giving up on your dream. Yeah.
Yeah.
John, you've got a lot of strong female characters throughout your books, aside from the two ladies in Salisbury who
right. What?
who feel badly that they were maybe misrepresented, and of course we know that it wasn't them at all. But do you have strong role model women in your life? Do you consider your wife and daughters strong women, and do you write in that voice?
No one has ever asked me that question. But yes, absolutely. I mean, my wife is a partner, and she's just rock solid human being. I mean, she just is wonderful, and she's my first reader, and she's very good at keeping me from going off the rails just as a beta reader. My children, all daughters, they're both strong young women. They're 16 and 14 now. I have a stepsister, you know, who's remarkable. She's been inducted into the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame, and my older sister, you know, is one of the toughest women I've ever known. She's built her own law firm and runs other businesses, and just a, you know, fabulous person. My mother is tough as nails. I mean, really, yes, I've been blessed to have really strong women in my life. And it's funny because, I mean, The King of Lies, let me back up. It's amazing the thing that people will tend to key on in any given book. For instance, I remember being sort of ambushed in an interview when The King of Lies first came out by a female interviewer who asked me, literally the first question of the interview, John, why do you hate women?
Oh, my goodness.
I thought that was so unfair. And I tried to explain this to her. The King of Lies is a study in the power of a strong father figure to utterly ruin the women in his life, to degrade his wife, to grind down his daughter. And the book at its core is about these people finding the strength to rise above that. And most of my books are about that search in some way or another, whether, you know, it's a woman or a man, but the quest to find the strength. And so my reaction to that question is that, you know, they read the book and saw their own issues reflected, not what was truly in the book, because
so true.
The book was all about how bad the men are, especially Work's father, and what it takes for the woman, in this case his daughter, Jean, to find the strength to live her life the way she wanted. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm being responsive to your question here. I mean,
I just think, to your point, John, that people put their own personal agendas on a story that, you know, they can't see. And we're kind of living in that culture right now anyway, I think, certainly politically from a media standpoint, where the personal agenda gets clouded by the larger story, the larger narrative that is painted into the total picture. They can't even see it.
You're right. People have their buttons, and they're easily pushed through no intent of mine. In Redemption Road, for instance, I get a fair amount of emails from people that think I'm attacking organized religion or that think I'm attacking, abortion rights. I mean, none of these things are true. I try to be fairly apolitical in my novels and make it all about the character. And so the questions for me are, what would drive, if this circumstance presents itself to a character, what is that character's response going to be? And I'm not going to censor the external pressures on those characters because I worry about someone's knee-jerk political reactions. I just think that that's ridiculous. In fact, I think that the number one rule of any writer, of fiction at least, is to never censor the story for fear of harming someone else's sensibilities. As soon as you do that, you're shooting yourself in the foot. And I'll give you a perfect example. In The King of Lies, Work's wife is sort of part of this cliquish group of really nasty women. In fact, she's as bad, or if not worse, than the two that I've already described. And as my wife was reading these chapters coming off the printer, she looked at me the first time we really saw how bad this guy's wife was. Keep in mind now, they were living in our house, in our town, and he had my job. And she said, "John, you can't do this to me."
To me.
To me.
Yeah, it was literally, "You can't do this," pause, "to me, because people are going to think you're writing about me." And I said, "Sweetheart, this is a weak, broken man living in my house. People are going to think that I'm writing about myself too." So
right.
Here's the best I can do for you. My wife is tall and blonde. I said, I'll make Work's wife petite and brunette. That's the only censoring I can do, and that's been something I've tried to live by in every book.
I got to tell you, it's such a pleasure to get to talk to you, John. Do you have any processes or rituals or things you do before, during, or after writing a novel that you like to do that are just kind of John Hart's own little thing that you've woven into the process? Well,
I can tell you that the gift I've given myself now that I'm a full-time writer is that I take a nap every day after lunch.
I love it.
And it's partly structural because I break my day into two parts. And in the morning, keep in mind I don't outline, which means I really have to listen to whatever instinct I have turning away inside about where the story should go. I mean, I'll often put things in motion without understanding what the resolution might be or what value it brings to the story. So I just have to trust that I can find a way to use it. And you don't want to censor that instinct either. I mean, it's really important. I call it driving the bus. It's really important to just let that part of the process flow. And that's what I do in the mornings. And then after lunch, I take a nap and flip a switch. And in the afternoon, I will edit those pages. So if I write 4 pages in the morning, I might edit it down to 2 before I call it quits at the end of the day. But I do have a neat little office on my farm. It's a single room attached to the end of an old tractor barn, and I go up there every day with my dogs, and it's just kind of our place. It's really nice.
That's awesome. Well, I saw that, I think on your Facebook page, Tom, which was your yellow lab, right, that you had forever. Yeah. We are dog lovers and animal lovers.
Very much so.
I've had 2, and I had a black lab named Jet that I had to say goodbye to that got cancer. And, well, I'll tell you, that'll check you in the heart, too. But I'm glad to hear that you've got new animals. Tom, too?
No, these are 2 other dogs we've had for a while. It was just the 3 of them. Tom was my guy, though. I mean, Tom and I go back 12 years, and he's been with me for pretty much my entire career. And there's a nobility in a yellow lab, as you probably know. And I'm not just a yellow lab, but there's the other dogs. They're wonderful pets, but they don't have that quality. And so, I feel like I really lost my
wingman
buddy when I lost Tom.
He was kind of with you on the journey. And here's the interesting thing, and Tam and I talk about this a lot, John. When you do something really incredible like you've done, which is not only find your passion and find your voice and put it on the page in a way that people really, really engage and resonate with, and do that not only for a living and the money and the success that comes with that, but just the internal satisfaction of this is what I was meant to do, and now I get to do it. And he was there, Tom was there with you. It's kind of like, and then you lose that. I know. I kept telling Jet, we're gonna make it. We're gonna make it, and I haven't made it to my own expectation yet. And of course, Jet is no longer with me, and so that's hard. That's hard because you have this idea in your head, and when you don't get there, or you haven't gotten there yet, let's put it that way, it makes it difficult. At least Tom got to see you do that.
Encourage you with this though, because it's easy to kind of feel the march of time and as if things are slipping away. But I want you to understand, I was 40 when I signed my first publishing contract. I mean, I know that I think you're right around there maybe.
Yep.
That's my impression. I could be wrong.
Yep.
We're all 29 in our hearts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're kind, John. I'm mid-40s, but yes.
Yeah. Well, the point I'm trying to make, though, is that the beauty of writing and aspiring to be published and such is there's no expiration date on that. I don't know if you've ever read Patrick O'Brien, who I think is probably I won't even use my own words. I think the New York Times called him the greatest writer of historical fiction ever. And he wrote his first book, I think, when he was 78. And had 15 runaway bestsellers before he died in his early 90s.
Oh, my gosh.
So, I just think that's amazing. And the film with Russell Crowe, Master and Commander, that was based on his books. I don't suggest you wait until you're 78, but if you take comfort from that, please do.
Well, I appreciate that, John. I really do, because I feel like I'm getting so many signals and encouragement from so many really, really talented writers to do this, and it's the time for the excuses and the nonsense to stop and sit down and put the words on the page, because I could talk to you forever. But do you give yourself you gave yourself a year for the third book? What does the timelines or deadlines or self-discipline related to writing look like for you early on versus maybe now as you're more experienced?
Like so many things we've talked about, there are really complexities here in different shades of gray. For instance, I think that self-discipline is very important in whatever shape it takes, whether it's a deadline or a daily word count. That's generally what I try to shoot for. 1,000 words a day is my goal. If I get 1,200, I'm happy. If I get 800, I'm still okay. But those need to be tight, edited words that I feel really strongly about, and that helps keep you on schedule, of course. And those are good things, because if you're talking about a year to write a book, it's very easy to say,
right.
I'll sleep in today, or I'll play golf, or whatever, and not get the work done. So that's a constant pressure to avoid those temptations. In fact, I think someone once said that cleaning the garage has never looked so attractive as when faced with the blank page. There's 1,000 ways to distract oneself. If you're solely going for an arbitrary measure, in my case, word count, I have found myself inevitably throwing out thousands and thousands and thousands of words that I wrote simply to try to hit that mark. So for me, writer's block is because I don't know exactly where the story is going next. So I can write 1,000 words a day and then end up a week later realizing that I'm off in the wrong direction and have to throw all that out. So sometimes it's important to listen to your inner voice and say, maybe I need to just step back, take a couple days off, and make sure I'm moving in the right direction. That's another downfall of the Growth and Hope School. The outliners don't have that problem. So, you got to keep yourself honest, but at the same time, you can write bad stuff by trying to hit a false deadline.
Oh, that's great advice.
That's so true. What do we have to look forward to?
The Hush.
The Hush. Okay.
And that's in reference to something in my third novel, The Last Child, a place called Hush Arbor. And The Last Child was about these two young boys trying to find a missing girl that's been gone for a year, and they're the only ones that are still looking. And during the course of these, I hate to even call them excursions, but they're going to the bad side of town, and they're tracking dangerous men, and they're doing things they shouldn't do. And at one point early in the book, the hero, Johnny, comes across an escaped convict out on the riverside, and they have this really terrifying encounter. And then throughout the course of the book, we see Levi, the escaped convict, on one track, and then Johnny on another. And a lot of the story coalesces around this swampy, hidden area in the far north of the county called Hush Arbor. And Hush Arbor is an historical term. Back during the slavery days, black slaves and I shouldn't even say black slaves, they were Indian slaves too, musty slaves, which were a mix of black and Indian. Slaves would often worship in secret because they were not allowed to embrace Christianity. And those
Wow.
that did find their way to that faith would go out into the woods and the swamps and worship in secret. And they referred to these places as hush arbors, or in some places brush harbors. This particular part of the county in The Last Child is a swampy area where these slaves once worshipped. Eventually the land was given to them, and this escaped convict is the descendant of that family. Johnny is actually the descendant of the man who freed the slaves back in 1853. So it's the reconvergence of these two families 170 years after one man freed another, so to speak. The Hush is the first sequel I've ever written, and it's a sequel to The Last Child. So the Hush of the title refers to Hush Arbor. Johnny is not 13 anymore. He's now 23. He lives half wild out on these 6,000 acres that he now owns that incorporates Hush Arbor and some other land. And it's a very different kind of book for me. You know, the first 5 have all been very much grounded in the real, let's say, although in The Last Child there were hints, just vague hints of magical realism in some of the questions that were posed about the relationship between these families and why did they reconnect after all these years, and some other questions that were really just hinted at. And a lot of readers picked up on them and followed up with me wanting to know more. And I never wanted to do a sequel simply because that book is it's my most personal and probably my favorite. And it was a perfect bubble of a world. It was exactly the way I wanted it by the end of the book, and I never wanted to disturb these boys and their relationships and all that I'd done with the book. But I finally realized that if I set a sequel 10 years later when they're young men, nothing I would write would disturb that world.
Right.
So this is a sequel set 10 years later. Johnny now lives out in the Hush Arbor area, and strange things are afoot in the swamp.
I love it.
Yeah, there's some supernatural stuff going on. I've never written that before.
Oh, how great is that?
But I've had absolutely the most fun exploring. I mean, there are parts of this book in the 1850s. There are parts of it during the Great Depression. There are parts of it in the modern times. And it's all about what's been going on between these two families. The Merrimans, who, under very vague circumstances, and at least in modern thinking, freed 100 slaves and consigned themselves to poverty for choice they made, and then the descendants of those slaves, and they're all still here in the same county. And I see that a lot where I grew up. I mean, there are families still have the same last name, the slave owners and the slave descendants, and they live in the same county and they share the same names, and some of them have reunions. I mean, it's really a fascinating thing.
I can't wait. So the release date for The Hush?
March 13th.
Of next year. March 13th of 2018. Hey, John, I wanted to ask real quick, have you ever had any ideas or entertained any thoughts about any of your books being turned into television shows, movies, feature films, things of that nature?
Sure. I mean, I've been to that dance a few times. And until someone yells action, I just don't believe it. You know, they call it La La Land for a reason.
Right.
And I think the sad truth is that, you know, writing is great because it's just the author and the page. It gets published, it doesn't, you know, whatever the case. But for me, it's very, very real. I can control it. Once a story gets into the hands of Hollywood, there are so many people that have to agree and so many people that can derail a project, you know, whether it's the money people, the director, the actors. You know, there are so many people that can just throw up their hands and move on to some other project. And I've been down that road many times. 2 of my books are in development right now. Will they eventually be made? I just don't know. I'm hopeful.
I mean, is that something that you aspire to see? Is your books on the screen?
Well, I think every writer would love to see it with the provision that it's actually well done, because I think that seeing a butchering of a story that really mattered to me would be very painful. And I know writers who have endured that. And the other side, of course, is seeing something beautifully done that takes these black and white pages and turns them into something as vibrant as a 2-hour full-length feature film. That would be something.
John, if our audience wants to learn more about you, wants to find your books, wants to engage with you, how can we send them to find you?
Absolutely. So I have a website. It's johnhartfiction.com. I don't keep that as updated as I should. I'm not very good with social media. I do have a Facebook presence that I generally direct most of my stuff to. It's John Hart Author on Facebook. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. And I do mostly Instagram when I'm on tour. I like to post pictures of the places I go. But Facebook and the website are the best way to keep track of me. For anybody that's interested, the paperback of Redemption Road will be out May 16th, and it does have 30 or 40 pages of the Hush as a little teaser in the back, which is
wonderful.
Fun.
I have the King of Lies, like the original, very first edition with the original dust jacket and everything from 2006.
Nice.
White glove treatment.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
I have 200 copies of those in storage.
Smart.
One of the cartons.
I think books are important. I think writing is important. I don't ever want us to, as a society, to feel like we're losing touch with the power of the pen. And I kind of feel a little bit that way, like we're living in this hyper fast culture of texting, and I just want people to be able to pick up a book and sit down and lose themselves and escape for an hour in the words and the characters and the stories that you and other talented writers create for them. It's like a whole other world.
Well, I think there's so many elements to that. Children today that are growing up clicking through countless screens, I mean, it affects their ability to go deep in concentration and imagination, and I think that books are so important for that. And of course, we really make sure that our children read. But I think that society in general, in spite of all the distractions, and that God knows there's so many of them, the society's not yet turned its back on storytelling. And I find that very encouraging. In fact, everyone was so frightened that ebooks would spell the end of publishing, but that's not happened. I mean, publishers have found ebooks very profitable. I was reading yesterday that in England, at least, ebook sales are down 17% because people are going back to the printed format because of basically screen fatigue. There's so many screens in their lives that they're rediscovering the beauty of the novel is to completely unplug and get away from the screens. It's the perfect technology in its printed form. I mean,
it's like vinyl records.
Yeah. I don't despair yet. I think it's hard for new writers because there is still some wariness in publishers. They're a little bit more cautious than they might have been 15 years ago. But there's still a demand, and there's still a marketplace, and that gives me hope.
Well, thank you, John Hart, for sharing your True North story.
You're the best, John.
The pleasure's been mine.
Thank you for listening to True North Story, the series. Follow us on Twitter @TrueNorthStory, and tune in next time for another True North Story.